Hello everyone, welcome once again to yet another session on Fundae. And what we are targeting today is to understand a very specific term that the RBI has come out in 2018, but it recently came in the news just a day or two back, wherein the RBI talked about the DPI, or the Digital Payment Index. Now, what is this Digital Payment Index? What is the entire context behind it? What are the parameters involved in this? And what is the relevance of DPI vis-a-vis the FinTech growth story in India? We'll discuss all of this in the session today. So what are we waiting for? Shuru kare? Right, so when we look at the broad parameters in this, let's try and understand that first of all. So essentially, when I talked about DPI, which is a Digital Payment Index, this was launched in March 2018. Obviously, the base has to be taken as 100. So what is an index? Index क्या होता है? Before we get into anything else. So जैसे हमने BSE इंडेक्स सुना है, so NSE का हमने इंडेक्स सुना है, तो BSE का सेंसेक्स है, NSE का निफ्टी है. So when I say index, what does that mean? Index is basically the reflection of performance towards some parameter, right? So for example, when you talk about the stocks that are there on NSE, which are there on Nifty 50, so that index basically kind of gives you the image of what is the performance of those 50 stocks. वो 50 stocks कैसे perform किए हैं, उनका let's say market capitalization कितना है, how are those companies performing. Those things essentially get captured in the let's say Nifty 50. Similarly, Sensex as well. So it basically gives you an indication of how effectively those stocks are performing. And because जो index बनाया गया है, it is made keeping in mind some of the most important companies from an India standpoint. It gives an overall reflection of how India is performing as a country as well when we look at an index. Similarly, when I talk about this index, which is your digital payments index, digital payments का मतलब क्या है? Anything that is happening in a non-cash mode, wherein there is no cash involvement at all, and it is completely happening online, that essentially becomes a digital payment. Now, a digital payment index क्या करेगा? Obviously, a digital payment index will tend to measure what is the level of sophistication, what is the level of technology being used, and how effective are these digital payments, especially because it's a index launched in India. So we are specifically talking about India as a country. So now, what are the parameters that the Digital Payment Index essentially looks at, right? So there are fundamentally 5 parameters that are being looked at. So the first one, of course, and has the highest amount of weightage as well, of 45% in the overall weight, is the payment performance. पेमेंट परफॉर्मेंस का मतलब क्या हुआ कि अगर आप कोई ट्रांजैक्शन एग्जीक्यूट करते हो, क्या वो ट्रांजैक्शन सक्सेसफुली रन हो पाता है कि नहीं, एंड अगर वो ट्रांजैक्शन सक्सेसफुली रन हो रहा है तो इज दैट ट्रांजैक्शन फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल हैपनिंग ऑन डिजिटल पेमेंट, और इज इट हैपनिंग वाया कैश, और लेट्स से सम अदर पेपर बेस्ड इंस्ट्रूमेंट. If it is happening still through a paper based instrument or through cash, then obviously the digital payment as a performance has not done well. That's the whole context, right? So the first biggest criteria is your payments performance, which basically looks at a 45%. The next second important index parameter is basically talks about something called as your payment enablers. Enablers का मतलब क्या होता है? Enablers are those entities or let's say elements which help improving the performance of something, and that is where your enablers come into the picture, right? So there are multiple enablers, and we'll be discussing about them in a short while, but that is the second critical parameter which has a weightage of 25%. So 45 हो गया, 25 हो गया, that brings us to a total of 70. Now the remaining basically is split into 3 more. So the third important criteria is basically your payments infrastructure from the supply side. Supply side का मतलब क्या है कि the service providers कौन कौन हैं जो payments growth करने के लिए इंडिया में digital side पे service provide कर रहे हैं, which are the entities which are providing services from a digital standpoint to help in the growth of payments in India. So that is your payments infrastructure from the supply side perspective. So that has a weightage of 15%. Then another 10% weightage is there for the second side of payments infrastructure, which is the payments infrastructure available on the demand side. एट द कंज्यूमर एंड कौन कौन से इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर्स अवेलेबल हैं जिसकी वजह से कंज्यूमर्स भी पेमेंट्स इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का इस्तेमाल कर सकते हैं. दैट बेसिकली बिकम्स द फोर्थ पैरामीटर विच इज योर पेमेंट्स इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर ऑन द डिमांड साइड. And the last parameter, and probably the crucial parameter to be looked at, is basically what is known as your customer centricity. Right? So customer centricity matlab, so it's not just about the transaction happening successfully, but it is about the user experience. Did the user get satisfied by that transaction? Did the user find it user friendly? Did the user find that entire experience worth going at it again? Or if it was too painful, will the user try and do a similar payment like that again? So that is where customer centricity also becomes a very important parameter. Now, what these parameters indicate to us is basically the sophistication of any country as far as its digital payments are concerned. Now, if you look at the weightage, India has given a weightage of 45% to your payments performance, which means right now we still are at a nascent stage. हम सिर्फ अभी भी बच्चे हैं as compared to the digital payments ecosystem in the world, which is where transaction successful होना हमारे लिए बहुत ज़्यादा important है as compared to a customer centricity जिसका weightage सिर्फ 5% है. But if you look at, let's say, more sophisticated ecosystems of the world जहाँ पे digital payments काफ़ी ज़्यादा evolve हो चुके हैं, वहाँ पे payments performance तो by default माना जाएगा कि it will happen successfully, right? So if you look at some of the sophisticated economies of the world, when you look at their digital payment systems, you will automatically understand कि what payment performance तो होना ही है, payment performance will definitely happen, right? So there you'll find that the weightage of, let's say, a parameter like customer centricity in the entire index could be a lot higher. And because we are in a nascent stage even now, that is where we find that the weightage for a parameter as important as customer centricity is only 5% at this stage, right? So it tells us that India as a digital economy is still evolving and there is still a long way to go, wherein customer centricity though is important, but it is not as important as some of the other parameters, right? So that is in a nutshell about the different weights and the parameters that are involved as far as your digital payment index is concerned. Now let's go a little deeper and try to understand as to which are the sub parameters that define the performance in any of these parameters, right? So the first thing that we look at is basically we will try and capture the overall performance vis-a-vis the most important criteria, which is your payment performance at 45%. Another thing that you will notice is that when you look at the middle of this chart, it basically indicates to you what was the value of that index at every subsequent measurement. So while the base was 100 in March 2018, the value in March 2019 was basically 153.47, which means there is definitely an improvement in the level of digital payments in India. Right? Now, when we talk about the most important parameter, which is your payment performance, what we need to look at is what are some of the key sub-parameters that decide the performance in this particular parameter. So the first thing that gets considered is what is the volume of transactions happening through your digital payment systems, obviously. Second, are people trusting enough to do high value transactions also through digital payment systems? So that is the next element. So the first is volume. Second is value. The third thing it tries to check is the number of unique users coming in. Is it the same kind of people coming and doing transactions again and again? Or are you able to get new people onboarded and do transactions? So your unique users also get considered as far as your payment performance is concerned. Next thing that it checks is paper clearing still happening? How exactly is paper clearing happening, right? So you talk about checks and the other ecosystem in the paper instruments front, and what kind of clearing is happening from that perspective. That also gets taken into account. The next thing that talks about is what is the currency in the circulation, right? So have these digital payments resulted in a reduction in the actual local currency? For example, the rupee that is there, is that also going down in circulation and the digital payments increasing proportionally? So that is something which also gets checked. So is the currency in circulation coming down in the context of paper-based instruments, and the currency in circulation increasing in the context of digital instruments? That becomes the next important parameter. And the last important sub-parameter that gets considered is, are there cash withdrawals still happening? And if cash withdrawals are happening, is it happening through pure cash, or are people withdrawing money through wallets or any other digital mode of instruments, right? So these are the fundamental sub-parameters that get taken into account when you're basically talking about the payment performance parameter within the gamut of the digital payments index. Now moving into the next segment, and again when we look at the overall performance, the index again rose a little higher in September 2019, where the number was basically at 173.49. Now we come to the second parameter, which is basically your payment enablers. Now, which are the payment enablers that get factored in terms of sub parameters? Firstly, the access and availability of internet. Second, mobile penetration that is there in the country. To what extent, especially in the India context, is Aadhaar penetration happening? Because you talk about the Aadhaar based payment systems or your Aadhaar enabled payment systems, all these become very relevant, especially in the context of the digital inclusion of the economy. That becomes very, very crucial. Next thing that you're looking at is do the people who are performing these transactions have bank accounts, right? So again, if no bank accounts are there, then predominantly all transactions will continue to take place on cash only. So bank accounts hain ki nahi, theek hai? How many participants are there, right? So that becomes very, very important. And last but not the least, it talks about a very important angle, which is your merchants. So when I say merchants ka matlab the people jo service provide kar rahe hain. So essentially in the context, in this case, we're talking about, let's say, the banks, you talk about your non-banking financial companies, then you talk about the different types of banks that are there, all of those guys, payments banks, small finance banks. So aap financial inclusion mein kitne level tak involve ho pa rahe ho, that basically depends on kitne merchants available hain, कितने agents available हैं as intermediaries which can support this digital revolution, so to speak, right? So these are the fundamental parameters that you look at when we talk about the payment enablers. So क्या क्या बोला हमने? इंटरनेट, हमने बोला मोबाइल, हमने बोला आधार पेनिट्रेशन, हमने बोला बैंक अकाउंट है कि नहीं, हमने बोला पार्टिसिपेंट्स कितने हैं, एंड लास्ट बट नॉट द लीस्ट हमने बोला कितने merchants involved हैं. So these are the sub parameters as far as your payment enablers are concerned. Now moving into the next segment, which essentially talks about the third criteria. And before we get into that, observe that the digital payment index has again further moved in March 2020 to a level of 207.84, which means it goes to show that it is constantly increasing. The index performance is continuously increasing, जिसका मतलब है कि digital payments का penetration और deeper होता जा रहा है. And now we get into the next parameter, which basically talks about your payments infrastructure, right? And this is from a supply side perspective. अब पेमेंट्स इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का मतलब क्या है कि कौन से सर्विसेज और प्रोडक्ट्स आप प्रोवाइड कर रहे हो ऑन दी पेमेंट साइड, जिसकी वजह से आपका डिजिटल पेनिट्रेशन ज्यादा हो पाए, राइट? सो व्हेन आई से पेमेंट्स इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर, वी बेसिकली स्टार्ट ऑफ विद द ब्रिक एंड मोटर एलिमेंट्स. ब्रिक एंड मोटर मतलब क्या कि जो आपके बेसिक बैंक ब्रांचेस हैं वो एग्जिस्ट करते हैं कि नहीं. देन आप कहीं पे भी टियर 3 टियर 4 सिटीज में जाएं, वन ऑफ द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट मेंबर्स इन दी बैंकिंग फ्रेटर्निटी आर योर business correspondents, right? These are the guys who act as the intermediary between the bank and the customer, right? उनका काम होता है कि कस्टमर की भाषा में, कस्टमर के लैंग्वेज में, in the vernacular, try and explain all the the product features and the benefits and what are the risks involved. So they explain these things to the customer in their own language and they are deriving benefit out of that. So those are your business correspondents. So your payments infrastructure, especially on the supply side, talks about your bank branches. It talks about your business correspondents. कितना ATM network है across the country, how many ATMs are there so that easy access is available. Then you talk about POS terminals. POS का मतलब होता है point of sale terminal. आप किसी भी स्टोर पे जाते हो, when you hand over your credit card or a debit card, so basically are you able to swipe that in a POS machine and the customer basically is able to pay, and obviously the retail shop owner or the shop owner is basically able to get the money out. एंड इसी में एक और फैक्टर आ जाता है आपका नियर फील्ड कम्युनिकेशन का, NFC की बात करते हैं हम. सो NFC क्या बोलता है कि मुझे कार्ड भी स्वाइप करने की जरूरत नहीं है. All I need to do is just, because it is near field communication enabled, all I need to do is basically either access my smartphone and transfer it to the other person's smartphone, just like your wallets, or even the QR code on your card can basically enable you to transfer the money without actually physically swiping a card. And that obviously becomes very relevant in today's context, jab hum we are very touch sensitive today, right? So corona ke aane ke baad all of us are very sensitive whether we want to share our card to someone else and that person touches that card. So all that becomes very important, and that is where near field communication at the point of sale is also a very important feature. Then obviously हमने बात की QR codes की, and then we're also talking about something called as the intermediaries. How many intermediaries are there? And when I say intermediaries, these are the FinTech players. जितने भी startup ecosystem में नए नए FinTech players आए हैं, उनकी वजह से नए नए फीचर्स मिल रहे हैं. सो जितने ज़्यादा intermediaries होंगे उतना ही ज़्यादा पेमेंट साइड में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर और बेटर होगा, at least on the supply side, right? That is the context, and these are the fundamental sub parameters when I look at payments infrastructure from the supply side perspective, which is your bank branches, your point of sale terminals, your ATMs, your QR code based generations, and then you talk about intermediaries, and of course last but not the least, the presence of business correspondents, right? So this is in a nutshell on the sub parameters as far as your payments infrastructure on the supply side are concerned. Now moving into the next element, which basically talks about the increase further in DPI. So when we looked at September 2020, this number was at 217.74. So that means again a further increase in the performance. That means digital payments index in India, which is an indicator of how good the digital payments systems in India are, has been constantly on the rise. And then we move on to the next parameter, which basically talks about the payment performance on this demand side now. अब demand side में क्या क्या facilities available हैं, let's try and understand that, right? So you talk about your debit cards, you talk about your credit cards, you talk about the evolution of your prepaid instrument service providers. So you're basically all your wallets and everything, all of that come into this picture. So you basically call it as your PPIs or your prepaid instruments, right? Then which are the customers who are registered for mobile and internet banking, right? So if you're a customer at a bank, but अगर आपका मोबाइल बैंकिंग और इंटरनेट बैंकिंग में रजिस्ट्रेशन है ही नहीं, तो वो फीचर्स आप कभी यूज कर ही नहीं पाओगे. So automatically what happens? You'll no longer be part of that digital revolution. So we need to talk about customers who are registered for both using internet as well as mobile banking. And the last sub parameter that you look at is basically the fast tags and the availability of fast tags at different locations, which can speed up the process even faster. So in a nutshell, when we talk about the evolution of the digital payments infrastructure from the demand side perspective, what are the key sub parameters that we're looking at? First of all, we're talking about the fast tags. We're talking about the customer registrations for your mobile as well as internet banking. Then you're talking about your debit cards, your credit cards, and last but not the least, we're talking about the prepaid instruments. So all of these parameters or sub parameters put together form what is your digital payments infrastructure on the demand side, right? Now, moving on to the final leg of the piece, wherein we say that today, as of March 2021, the DPI or the digital payment index for India basically stands at a value of 270.59, which indicates that the digital payments ecosystem in India has been continuously rising and continuously performing a lot better than the previous evaluation. And when we look at the numbers so far, it has been a half yearly turn, right? So हमने देखा कि हर बार September और March में result निकल के आया, right? So right now we have the result for March, and then after some months we'll basically get the performance in the month of September as well. That's the context, right? So we stand at 270.59 in terms of the digital payments index, and that brings me to the last piece in this entire donut, which is basically your customer centricity and that 5%. अब customer centricity आप कैसे लेके आ सकते हो? How can you make the customer as the center of your universe? So which are the parameters or sub parameters that you will consider here? First things first, क्या आपके सिस्टम में फ्रॉड्स हो रहे हैं? अगर फ्रॉड्स हो रहे हैं तो हाउ आर यू सॉल्विंग दोज फ्रॉड्स सो दैट द कस्टमर गेन्स इमेंस अमाउंट ऑफ ट्रस्ट इन द डिजिटल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर. सो द फर्स्ट थिंग फ्रॉम अ कस्टमर सेंट्रिसिटी स्टैंड पॉइंट इज, आर फ्रॉड्स हैपनिंग? इफ फ्रॉड्स आर हैपनिंग, how quickly are you mitigating and eradicating those risks? That's the first thing. Second, system downtime. कितनी देर तक आपका सिस्टम डाउन रहेगा जब तक कस्टमर्स आपके सिस्टम को एक्सेस नहीं कर पाएंगे? दैट अगेन बिकम्स अ वेरी क्रिटिकल पैरामीटर, बिकॉज अगर बहुत टाइम तक आपका सिस्टम अगर डाउन रहे, then customer will lose interest in that platform, right? So it's important that the system should be available for long durations of time without any outages. So that becomes your second sub parameter, which is your system downtime. The third thing that you're talking about is obviously complaints. So बेसिकली ट्रांजैक्शन सक्सेसफुली रन हो रहा है तो ठीक है, अगर नहीं रन हुआ तो क्यों, क्या प्रॉब्लम्स आए, कस्टमर को कंप्लेन क्या है आपसे, क्या आप कंप्लेंट्स को रिजॉल्व कर पाते हैं, हाउ गुड इज योर कस्टमर ग्रीवेंस रिड्रेसल मैकेनिज्म, ऑल दोज थिंग्स बिकम इंपॉर्टेंट. सो कंप्लेंट्स इज द नेक्स्ट एंगल एज फार एज कस्टमर सेंट्रिसिटी इज कंसर्न. नेक्स्ट थिंग, क्या आपके ट्रांजैक्शंस डिक्लाइन हो रहे हैं? So if the transactions are happening, what is the percentage of declines? If there are far too many declines happening, that means the system is not reliable enough. There are way too many declines happening. So that's the next parameter or other sub parameter, which is your declines in the, the payments infrastructure. The last but most important sub parameter here is the awareness and education. So there are a lot of things that India is doing from a perspective of financial education, financial literacy. This awareness and this trust will basically forge the trust for the people in the system so that they're willingly coming forward and accessing the system without any fear whatsoever, right? To sum up, which are the key sub parameters as far as your customer centricity is concerned? So first things first, frauds. Second thing, we're talking about system downtime. The third thing that we're talking about is customer complaints. Fourth thing that we're talking about is declines. And last but not the least, awareness, and education. So these are encapsulating the entire digital payments index for you guys. And that was the intention of this session, to basically give you an overview of DPI, or RBI's Digital Payments Index. The value currently stands at 270.59, which means that there's a steady increase in the index after every 6 months, after having been launched in March 2018 with a base of 100. So it's been a phenomenal performance. And as they say, there are miles to go before we sleep. And similarly, there are miles to go for India as far as the digital payments index and the digital payment ecosystem is concerned. Lots to do, lots to achieve. And I'm sure that all of us will be key participants in this entire revolution, right? So this is what I have to share in this particular session. I look forward to seeing you in the next one with some more interesting concepts. Until then, have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful week ahead. This is Ravi signing off.